Wait, you're how old? This week on the Knowing God podcast.
All right, welcome back. My name is John.
And I am Caleb Rowland.
This is another episode of the Knowing God podcast, continuing a discussion we started last week on the issue of revitalization, church revitalization.
Part 2.
This is part 2. We're going to be looking at really part 3 next week on the issue of church planting, which is kind of another side of the same coin. But this week, and so we really wanted to get into some of the practicality and just get right into this conversation. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully as a lead in, hopefully you've listened to last week's. If you haven't, be a good opportunity to stop this now and actually listen to last week's discussion, because I think it sets the table really well for how we're going to do this.
Agreed. And we want your views. So like, subscribe, everything else down below, do that too.
And comments too are very, very helpful. Feedback as well. So let's get into a little bit of, the how. And we kind of teased this a little bit at the end of our conversation last week, but let's get straight into this now and talk a little bit about just when we think about church revitalization, we're talking about a U-turn, a change of direction. That there is a church that's going into decline, and then there is an inflection point of something, and then you see a return back to growth and flourishing.
Correct.
And that's what we're chasing. That's what revitalization is really all about.
Right. And it's often churches who have been around the community for years, decades, generations. You're talking about churches sometimes that might have a 100-year history that are, in decline, that maybe have been in decline for a while. Or you could be talking about churches that, aren't very old at all. Maybe they've, peaked in the 90s, and even though the 90s was a long time ago now. But either way, that there's a spectrum that you can talk about when you talk about church.
Definitely a spectrum. So, why do we care about this? We mentioned that, this is a stewardship issue last week. Another thing that we could say as far as the why is churches have reputations in a community.
Yes.
There is a return, especially post-COVID, to this idea of the neighborhood church being just an essential part of just a neighborhood's witness and neighborhood's, kind of just culture. And so churches, one of the things I always like to tell our church, and it's not original to me, is that your address is not an accident, that God has placed our church here specifically in this location for a specific purpose. And so we do have a reputation in our community. And as churches begin to decline, they become more and more irrelevant. And sometimes churches do things to anger the community.
Right.
Sometimes churches do things to make themselves, kind of cut off from the community. They don't look like their community anymore, for example. And so when we come to revitalization and this topic, we're really kind of thinking about, what is the reputation of the church? Has it been soured? What are ways to return the church to a place and a position of strength and an asset in the community? And that's always going to come back to, what are you doing for the people in your community?
Absolutely. And I think to recognize that people have baggage sometimes, especially if you're an older established church. I think it's 4 out of 10 individuals from a Barna study in 2015 said that they don't go to church because of hurt from a past congregation.
Right.
And so if you've been established in a community, there's probably some people out there who are a little salty. There's probably some people out there, and maybe it's, not fully your fault. I understand that. But whenever we talk about reputation, that's a big thing, right? And if you've been there, you probably have some people who are detracting, some people who are not necessarily thrilled about your church and probably wouldn't shed a tear if your church shut its doors. And that is something that a group of revitalizers has to address, right? Is what is your witness in the community? What does that look like?
Yep. Another thing that I love about revitalization is that being a pastor in a church that has needed revitalization, I see this as a way to shepherd our people from going to a place of focus, of Great Commission emphasis. And again, if you know anything about our church here, this has been a Great Commission church. Metropolitan has had a vibrant witness in our city for many, many decades and has been a church of really a stellar reputation. And so my desire is to kind of take that and pay that forward and continue to push that forward. But our church was in decline when I got here, and that's not anything we're not going to say that that's a particular person's fault or anything. It just happens.
Right.
It is the reality of the way things go. And so one of the things I want to see is the church is more about what you can do and how you can join in what God is doing in your community instead of just being a place of your personal preferences. Where
Correct.
those kind of that is really what church is about. It's about me and what I want. And you've got to shepherd people through that transition, and that can be very, very difficult.
Definitely. And so if you are out there listening to this in whatever church, don't make your pastors choose between reaching the community with the gospel of Jesus Christ and your preferences. Because so many times that's often what leads to decline in the church, right? Yeah. It's just, I like the way this is comfortable, everything is fine. But honestly, if that was reaching people would be reached, right? I mean, you've been doing things that way for 40 years. I mean, and if that was really being effective, then churches wouldn't be declining. So there's a certain level of rethinking that we have to do there. And that's kind of what we're going to get into now, the how. How do we need to rethink? What are the actual practical steps that people can take, churches can take, members can take to be able to revitalize churches? So
the first thing I would say in terms of the how is, especially for the pastor, is you have to pray, you have to preach, and you have to stay. Mm-hmm. And those three, I think, are just critical.
Right.
You've got to be a praying pastor. You've got to call your church into a season of dependence. That we need to be more about what Jesus wants our church to be rather than what we want our church to be like. Yeah. That he is the one ultimately that calls the shots, that the Great Commission is not a suggestion. Mm-hmm. It is a Great Commission. Right. It is the imperative for how the church is to behave and to operate and structure its ministries.
Correct.
And so that does require a continual prayer and dependence, but also a preaching and proclamation of that truth. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes, pastors might come into a revitalization context and they think it's going to be really, really fast, and they think it's going to be really, really easy. And so if you're a pastor getting ready to go into one of these churches, I just want to tell you, it is really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And so it is going to be, at times, brutal.
Right.
It just is.
It is. It's like doing physical therapy, right?
Right.
I mean, I had an injury this last year and had to do a lot of physical therapy. And there was kind of two options. It was either let my leg atrophy and not be able to use it anymore and kind of lose functionality and lose its purpose, or go through a pretty considerable amount of pain over an extended period of time to be able to have it work and function as it was supposed to function. And so in the same with church revitalization is that it's atrophied, right? There's an issue there. There's some rebuilding that needs to be done. There's some physical therapy that's going to have to take place. There's going to be some bending in some different ways and some stretching that maybe the body's not used to. But all of those things are required in order to get that limb back to a place of health, in order to get that body back to a place where it is fully functional, where it is healthy and operating in the way it's supposed to.
And I would say, too, for the pastor that's in a revitalization context, he has to stay. Mm-hmm. He has to be resilient.
Right.
And it's really easy to get frustrated and say, I'm out.
Right.
Another thing, though, is it's kind of the demeanor and how you stay. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to kind of just stay and just like grit your teeth and we're just going to go through this and we're going to make a bunch of people mad and, whatever, it's the way it is, and you get really cynical. Mm-hmm. You have to stay with a soft heart. Mm-hmm. You're still called to be a pastor.
Yes.
You're still called to be a tender shepherd, not a cynical, let's just beat the sheep into submission kind of staying.
Correct. And so like keeping that heart posture correct. And then in the same time, in that loving way, in that tender way, calling people and letting them see that this is an urgent matter, right? Because a church, revitalization, even though it takes a long time, it has to start as quickly as possible.
That's
because of the length of the process required. That if you're going to revitalize a church, the time to do it is now. I think it was Paul David Tripp who said the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time to do it is today.
Well, that's good.
And so it's just like you could, yes, it would have been great if we would have picked up on this, in the past, but it doesn't matter. What we can do now is start today. Start today and do it now.
So what you're talking about is, kind of point number 2 that we have here is establishing a sense of urgency. And that can be done in a variety of ways. It can be looking at, here's where our metrics were, our numbers were in the past. Here's where we are today. And sometimes, taking that stark difference of, membership, database, here's how many members we had, and then 20 years later, here's who we have. being confronted with that reality, sometimes people are jolted by that and say, I had no idea. And sometimes that can happen so slowly that you don't even notice.
Correct.
And so we have to, as pastors, give a sense of urgency. One of the things that I had to do in my first year, it was incredibly uncomfortable, but I had to sit in front of the church and say, okay, we have 18 months of living the way we're doing and doing church the way we're doing it until we enter into financial ruin and insolvency. You got 18 months. So that demands some change. And that did, kind of arouse some people to change and to see a sense of urgency. So you got to paint that picture.
You definitely do, and I think that's one of the difficult things. Like you said, that's the first, that was the first year you were here, and so that's that resilientness that pastors need, and then the sense of receptivity that the congregation needs, right? So if you're watching this as part of a congregation, there's going to be things that you don't like, but you need to be open and receptive to that outside perspective, and I think that's really important. And so then the next thing would be that we need to define the present reality, right? But then also be a voice of hope, because like you said, defining the sense of urgency sometimes can be almost like doom and gloom, doomsday, we're all going to die. But then you also have to give them that sense of hope. So how does that work?
I think a real practical way of doing that is, identify things that are going really, really well. In any church, you're going to have some things that have momentum.
Right.
Some things don't, but some things do. And so you can call attention. And so I always tell our staff, you become who you celebrate, or you become what you celebrate. So for example, if we have a really successful vacation Bible school, that we are reaching families and community in our community, and families that don't have any connection whatsoever to our church, or do we celebrate, church events? This last week we had a 4th of July picnic. We had a lot of people here, a lot of new people too, a lot of people that were honestly not as connected to our church before, but hopefully events like that, you can call attention to that and say, look at some of the things that we're doing.
Correct.
So calling attention to that hope, calling attention to that reality, you have to do both. And if you don't do both, I think if you only focus on the present reality, you sound like Eeyore.
Right.
And you kind of depress people. Exactly. If all you do, though, is give people hope, I think you're being rather Pollyanna.
Correct.
And you're not being really kind of true to the reality that exists today. So you got to do both.
You do. And striking that balance can be difficult, and it will be painful because, again, there's going to be, we often call them sacred cows. There might be some ministries that people really love and maybe have invested a lot of energy into, and they're just not effective anymore. And they're just not accomplishing their purpose. Maybe they've dwindled down and there's, hardly anybody as a part of that ministry. And it's going to be difficult because, it doesn't mean that it wasn't good at one point. It doesn't mean that it wasn't once beautiful. It doesn't mean that it didn't have an impact for the kingdom. It just means that in the present time, it's not effective. It's not working. There needs to be something that happens. And sometimes that can be the hardest things for people.
That is, man, that is so hard. And the way you kind of get over that hump, I think, is you have to cast a vision for a greater tomorrow.
Right.
You as the pastor really do have to try to define that for people and to go back to that. So, one of the pictures that we've used here, that I've used occasionally, and it's rather trite and it's cliche, but it's the idea of a handoff.
Right.
Where we have a generation of saints that have run and run and run and been faithful, and so they have to make that transition. They have to hand that baton off to the next person in the relay to take that baton and run it with endurance.
Right.
I think sometimes, though, when we use images like that, and I've heard this and felt this in our church, and if you're part of our church and listening to this, you're probably listening very carefully to what I say right now, and I might get myself in a little bit of trouble. That doesn't mean, though, that when you release the baton that you go sit in the stands and say, I'm done. I'm just, it's over now.
Right.
I'm irrelevant. I'm old. No, there's a continuation of coaching, of mentorship, of empowerment, of equipping, of supporting, and it's like when that happens, I think revitalization can indeed happen and does happen because you have this championing of this new generation. So you got to define that picture of what the better future looks like.
Yes.
Another thing you have to do in that is you have to help people to see that there may have been a season in the church that, the church was very, very vibrant and very, very healthy. And there's going to be a kind of this gravitational pull to go back to yesteryear.
Right.
Back when Brother Bill was here, and the church was vibrant. And you can get so focused on the past, you can miss the present reality and the future that God has for your church today.
Definitely. And I think that we all have to be careful. All of us who have been believers for any amount of time, we are all very prone to turning inward,
Yes.
to thinking that the best type of ministry is the type of ministry that I came to salvation under. The best type of worship is the kind that I had whenever I was, learning how to play an instrument or something like that. And the danger is that the older we get, the less willing we are to adapt. And that's, I think, a really difficult thing. And that's not just age, that's the more time we've spent in Christianity in general. And it's really sad because sometimes I've seen people who come to Christ and and they're just on fire and they're like, you just tell me what I need to do. Like, what's going to be the way that we reach people, that other people's lives can be transformed in the same way that my life was transformed. And the methodology is much less important than the message that's going out. But unfortunately, as we get older, sometimes it becomes the methodology are the things that we really value and hold dear, and it's the message that's sometimes lost in the middle of that.
Yep. And so, the next thing I would say, and kind of in light of that point, is if you're a revitalization pastor, you have to lead people through change. The world is changing. It's changed a lot since March 2020.
Right.
And you have to be able to lead people through that change. And that's going to be very, very difficult.
It is.
Change is a psychological, pinch point, pain point for a lot of people. And I think churches can kind of really fall victim to this. That everything else is changing in my life, don't change my church, right? And so there can be a real resistance. And so you have to be able to define what is tradition. Okay, tradition is very, very strong. And church tradition and church doctrine and traditional beliefs of orthodoxy, you got to focus on that.
Yes.
What is traditionalism?
Right.
And I think a lot of times, it's kind of we mistake the message for the methods, and we get so fixed on the methods that we become resistant to changing the methods because we think that that's going to change the message.
Correct. They are intertwined. They're kind of inseparable sometimes in our mind, and I think that's we have to remove those two things from each other and say, is the message going forward in a way that is clear, that is consistent with Scripture, that is consistent with the tradition, the long tradition of Christian history, but at the same time, that might not be like I'm used to. Because if it was, like original traditionalism, we'd still be all doing Gregorian chants. Everything would still be in Latin. We'd still be, this would be a very different. Things have changed over time, and so we have to realize that.
And tradition and traditionalism, I should say too. That is very powerful, and it can be formative. Like we don't want to say that all traditions that churches have are bad.
No, absolutely. And we love hymns, and we do a lot of hymns here. And I think even new church plants, like specifically, can still value those hymnody and the way that things were in some of those ways. But that doesn't mean that that's the only way. That doesn't mean that that's the only way.
Exactly. Or, and I'm going to step on some toes when I say this, the hymnal is not the inspired word of God.
Correct.
And sometimes I think that mistake can be made where it's like, well, we sang it this way when I was this old, and I have, fond memories when I would go to grandma's church and, rural Oklahoma, whatever here, and that's the way that has to be sung. And that's not necessarily true.
No, not at all. And so I think that that's a difficult thing for pastors, is that we have to lead them through that change. You have to be the voice that says, I understand, I love you, I care about you, I value your opinion, but this is where we have to go.
And a part of that is going to come back to your role as a shepherd in having relational intentionality.
Yeah.
There is always going to be a way for pastors to build bridges, to lead people through this change. This is not just a carte blanche, ultimatum, change or else, right? You're bringing people through this, and that will be slow, and that requires some degree of relational intentionality. And that's also going to be, I think, focused intently on building new leaders.
Yes.
And building new people and bringing new people in, which is a big part of church planting, of course. Talk about that next week. But bringing new people along and cultivating leadership and even letting go of some things. Maybe the power group has to let go of some of their power to see that transition take place.
Absolutely.
It has to be intentional. It doesn't just happen.
It does. And I think that's, for whoever is in the congregation, so important, because if they can see, for example, that building up new leaders, those building intentional relationships and seeing those things happen, then, whenever a grandparent's grandchild comes to know the Lord who is far from Christ, then it softens a grandparent's heart a little bit to say,
does it.
like, oh, maybe we didn't sing the hymn exactly like we used to sing it. But for some reason, my grandchild has now found a place, and not just a place, but they feel like they can actually have ownership in a ministry, like they can have leadership in an area of ministry, which is a diametric change from where they used to be. So whenever we see those things start to happen, I think that even some of the staunchest traditionalists can maybe have their hearts softened and changed whenever we have those relationships that are really intentional and that are really life changing. So.
Yeah, and just speaking to pastors that are going through this. There are going to be some in your congregation that will not make this change, and that may be okay.
Yeah.
In a sense, we hate to lose people. We hate to see people leave our church. I mean, we're all pastors. We're all people, and that hurts on a emotional level.
Yes.
But there may be some out counseling that needs to take place, and that sounds really mean, but it's not intended to be. It's a way to shepherd and say, maybe this is the direction that you need to go, but. The win is when those people, like you just described, are the staunch traditionalists, and they can see the validity, they can see the new health, the new fruit on the vine. They can become some of your biggest fans.
Absolutely. And it's beautiful when that happens because, that's one thing as a church plant right now, that as we're gathering people and we're kind of gathering, those who are going to be part of our core team, is we're looking and saying, we are really young, which is great, but also it would be nice to have some senior saints who would say, like, yes, we'll come with you. Yes, we'll commit to this. And so I think that's just so beautiful when you can see that happen, right?
Last thing I would say, and this kind of covers everything, is this is not my expression. This is Mark Clifton's words, but having tactical patience. I think you have to, as a church revitalizer, have some degree of tactical patience. There are 100 things that need to change, but it might be, hey, this needs to change today, this needs to really change tomorrow. And so wisdom, I think, is appropriated here as far as, okay, what needs to change now and what can perhaps wait as we evolve and change as a church.
Absolutely. And those waters can sometimes be murky. So for pastors and congregants, just know that not everything's going to be right. Not going to get everything right the first time. There's still going to be, your pastor's not going to bat 1,000. Not every idea is going to go over well. Not every outreach is going to bring in the masses. Not every change is going to result in, this instant or even, eventual, reunification of all the things that you are imagining. But things can't stay the same.
Yeah.
They can't stay the same, or death will occur. Yeah. So, yes, change is going to happen. It's not always going to be perfect. It is going to be messy. So pastors have tactical patience, and the same for people who are in the congregation. Have patience. Wait to see what God could do. That might be a new thing. It might be a little uncomfortable, but it could be beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end it. We could talk a lot about this, as it's obvious in our conversation the last 2 weeks. But I think just calling everybody to a state and a mindset of grace, gospel grace, and having grace to your pastor, having grace in the church, that grace would really be the defining attribute of health, in our churches, and that can be a very, very beautiful thing. So I hope this has been helpful to you the last 2 weeks. We talked about revitalization. Next week, we're going to be talking about church planting, which will be in many ways a continuation of what we've been looking at. So join us next week. We love you. Thank you so much.